I think you're absolutely right to be sceptical about the levels of progress that are often achieved at COPs. Progress is very painfully slow, particularly in the sort of final text that often gets agreed at the end of each summit, which needs every country to sign on to it. So it just takes one country to object to a particular clause or particular bit of language, and then the whole thing has to be watered down and the ambition weakened.
Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Matthew Lesh. I'm the Head of Public Policy here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalising policy question to top political and economic thinker. Today's question, is COP27 a waste of time? The UN's annual summit on climate change began this week in Sharm el-Sheikh, coastal city in Egypt, and marks 30 years since the UN Convention on Climate Change, with global leaders from President Joe Biden to France's Emmanuel Macron and the UK's Rishi Sunak in attendance. The conference is targeted at the goal of keeping climate change well below 2 degrees, strengthening adaptation and resilience, and climate finance issues. To discuss COP, its purpose, and what we might see out of it, I'm very excited to be joined by Sam Hall, who's the director of the Conservative Environment Network, as well as a former policy advisor to Michael Gove when he was Secretary of State for the Environment. Thanks for joining, Sam.
Thanks for having me on.
Let's just start with the basics, since we hear that three-letter word say quite a lot. What is a COP?
So COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and essentially there have been 27 of them now since the original UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed back in the early 1990s. And essentially they're a chance for the 190 odd countries that are signatories to that UN convention to come together and to talk about what each country is doing collectively on climate change, and I guess to take stock of the progress that's been made over the past year. And crucially, since we signed the Paris Agreement back in I've forgotten when it was, 2015. We want to take stock of how we're doing in terms of getting on track to the temperature goals that were agreed back in Paris. So we, looking at all the different countries' individual national pledges, and do they add up to enough to mean that we're on track to that 2 degree of warming, or indeed 1.5, which was the stretch goal that was agreed back in Paris.
So I think COP is criticised both from sections of the kind of environmental left, as well as from the climate skeptic right, or even maybe not climate skeptic right, but ones who are a little bit more skeptical of these kind of big international elite fests. You have Greta Thunberg saying it's greenwashing, lying and cheating, although I think she also then said she was disappointed Rishi wasn't going at that point, but she ultimately did decide to go. Do you think there's a risk that we put too much emphasis on these conferences, that year to year there isn't actually that much change in the policy? More or less, a lot of the policy change that's needed is at a domestic level, or it's through innovations that are going to help address climate change. A lot of what's discussed at COP is pre-arranged. It's kind of, there's a lot of international conferences, nothing inherently wrong with the international conference, but just seems like this particular one, maybe more so because it was in the UK last year, just gets like a disproportionate level of interest and intrigue and focus.
Well, I think they're necessary to have each year, because, obviously each individual country can't on its own solve climate change. It's something that we're going to have to all solve together. One country getting to net zero won't be enough to stop the disastrous levels of climate change that the scientists warn us will come if we don't all reach our mission. So I think that the need for international cooperation is therefore important to tackling climate change, and I think we need a forum where countries can do that. I think you're absolutely right to be sceptical about the levels of progress that are often achieved at COPs. Progress is very painfully slow, particularly in the sort of final text that often gets agreed at the end of each summit, which needs every country to sign on to it. So it just takes one country to object to a particular clause or particular bit of language, and then the whole thing has to be watered down and the ambition weakened. I do think, however, it is an opportunity for countries to work on side deals or coalitions of the willing, where groups of countries can come together to agree certain things. So to give an example, last year at COP26, a whole range of countries with large areas of forest came together to agree a deal to end deforestation and a package of finance as well to support those countries with more sustainable forest management and agricultural practices, so that there weren't those economic incentives that there are at the moment. agreement for chopping down pristine forests. That didn't get complete agreement across all the members of the COP process, but it did get that coalition, the willing, and crucially, the vast majority of the world's forest players were signed up to that deal. So I think there is an opportunity to forge these slightly smaller coalitions, and it's ultimately, I think, a really good forcing mechanism. It's that countries have to bring something to COP. They have to think about their climate commitments in advance of COP, and it's a good opportunity, I think, to get the various civil services and bureaucratic structures to think about what COP each year.
Yeah, so kind of going on to that point in terms of where the commitments are at in relation to Paris. So as you've said, there was this intriguing wording in the Paris Agreement, which is, the goal is 2.5, and then the stretch goal, ideally less than 2 degrees warming at 1.5. Now, The Economist, I think, an intriguing cover story this week or leading story this week on climate change suggested that basically the 1.5 degrees goal is dead, that based upon the current commitments from countries, you're probably going to see something like 10% emissions increases by 2030. What you actually need is something like a 45% decrease. And therefore, the COP process isn't necessarily working to deliver the stated intended goals, and you might need to think more radically or differently about if you want to stop climate change. I guess that's kind of almost the argument. You could see that in two ways. You could see that as an argument from the Just Stop Oil lot that we need to take quite extreme actions to decarbonize the economy, or you could see it as just a dismissal of the whole COP process. What do you make of where we're at in terms of the carbon reduction commitments?
I think the 1.5 degree goal is going to be incredibly challenging to hit. I think, as you said in your question, the level of pledges that we've got at the moment is not enough. We're probably on track for something like 2.5 degrees of warming, assuming all those pledges are met. And whilst 90% of global GDP now is covered by net zero goals, which I think will ultimately mean that, in terms of long-term levels of emissions, if all those targets are met, we won't go too far above that 2.5 degrees, because climate change is the product of cumulative carbon emissions going into the atmosphere over many years. If we have another few years of these very high, historically high levels of carbon emissions going into the atmosphere, that near term tipping over, we're currently about 1.1, 1.2 degrees of warming to the 1.5 degrees. We're going to hit that very soon. So I think it is, it is looking very challenging, but I don't think it's a counsel for despair. I think every 0.1 degrees of warming that we can avoid means much less economic and social damage caused by climate change. So it is still worth trying as hard as we can to get as close to that 1.5 degrees as possible. And, there are some countries very low lying below sea level for whom that 1.5 degree target is existential. And I think that's why it is, important at the COP for countries to, continue to fight for that target as hard as possible.
Yeah, it seems kind of obvious to me that you can get too obsessed about 1.5 degrees and you're getting it down from 2 degrees to 1.8 or 1.7 degrees, at least according to the modeling, which suggests, that lesser impact on the margin in terms of rising sea levels, exposed people to extreme heat, and all the other issues. Now, the underlying problem here, of course, seems to be the fact that, and there's been some interesting commentary this week about the fact that the UK has reduced carbon emissions probably more than any other country, at least domestic carbon emissions in the last 20 to 30 years. The West has very much maxed out its carbon emissions and is per capita declining, if not in absolute terms, certainly on the way down. Where we're seeing the substantial increase in emissions, of course, is in the developing world, particularly from China and India, who don't seem to take the climate change issue anywhere near as seriously. Is there a way around this? This seems to be the continuous issue here, which is, some other statistic which was coming out was in the last 8 years, China has emitted more than in the last 220 years in the UK. And therefore, although it is great and the UK should do things about climate change, it's not the be all and end all if you can't effectively persuade China somehow to not emit as much as they develop. Or maybe you say, well, they do need to emit. It's righteous and good for them to develop, and they should be able to emit in the way we did in the past.
Well, no, I think China, India, and lots of these developing countries are not doing enough in terms of emissions reduction. I mean, they would argue that, as you said, that they should be allowed to develop and to pollute whilst they develop, and if the developed countries want to see them cut their emissions faster, then they should provide more finance to help them with the costs of the transition and to build the renewable energy and the other infrastructure that we need. But I think the reality is that if we do not see faster near-term emissions cuts from some of these developing countries, some of these critical tipping points in terms of the climate will be reached. We will cross the 1.5 degree threshold and so on. So I do think they need to go further. But I don't think any of this means that the UK should give up on its climate leadership. I think firstly, as you said, we've got this incredibly impressive emissions reduction record, fastest in the G20, and it's happened at the same time as growing our economy. And we've been one of the fastest growing economies in the same time period as we've been cutting our emissions in the G7. So I think that positive story we can tell about how you can grow your economy, how you can develop economically, and at the same time cut your emissions is one that the UK can promote. And the other area I think that we can have an outsized influence is in terms of technology development and trade. If we can develop these clean technologies, bring them down in costs, innovate, and then export those technologies around the world through our network of free trade agreements and opening up of new markets, then I think it's a very powerful way in which we can use markets and capitalism to drive down emissions overseas beyond our borders and not just have impact in terms of our territorial emissions here in the UK.
So this has been, I think, one of the major issues discussed at COP is this question of climate reparations, or also known as loss and damage. There's some claim that about $1 trillion by 2050. There was a previous commitment for $100 billion in annual climate finance by 2020 to 2025. Doesn't really eventuated. Where do you think those debates are at? Is there a kind of penance that the West should pay to the developing world, or is that the wrong way potentially to think about it as a punishment? My colleague Emily Carver, I think, argued in Con Home today that in fact we should thank the West for developing. You shouldn't punish the West for creating economic prosperity. That's overall been a good thing, and that we shouldn't think in those kind of terms about reparations.
I mean, I think I generally struggle with sort of the notion of historic responsibility, and that this sort of current generation of taxpayers in the UK should be expected to bear costs for things that their ancestors did, and ultimately that things that their ancestors weren't really conscious of as well in terms of the negative impact. So I don't agree with the sort of principle of historic guilt, and I think financially it's such a potentially unlimited liability that the UK could be signing up to if it accepts the principle of loss and damage. I do, however, think that there is a need for developed countries to put in finance to enable this transition. Some of it, I think, can be done on a commercial basis. Lots of renewable energy is now cost competitive, and there may be a role for government in guaranteeing some of the private sector lending and investment into developing countries to get this infrastructure built. But fundamentally, that can be done on a commercial basis. I think funding countries to adapt to warmer climates, to less water, to food insecurity, that will help the UK ultimately, I think, in terms of dealing with some of the drivers of migration and conflict and instability around the world. And I think, as the UK has done historically, it is right that we step in if there's been a disaster, or there's been some kind of natural disaster which has made people homeless and caused lives to be lost. I think there's always that moral argument for wealthier countries to choose to donate money to those countries to help them clean them up. But I think all of those things can be done, but I think accepting the principle of climate reparations would be very damaging, and I can't see it commanding popular support in the UK.
Yeah, I think kind of brings me where to next in terms of responding to climate change. I consider myself a market environmentalist and want to try to see the government would love to see the government trying to pick less winners, not supporting hydrogen or carbon capture, but having a carbon tax in place that would incentivize investments and in innovation. I don't think that's necessarily where the global debate is at. There doesn't seem, I suppose there's movements by, although now criticized as greenwashing, by major institutional investors to try to move around where they put their money, et cetera, et cetera. Is there a good story about the market responding to climate change, over responding, some might even say, in some respects? Or what is the kind of role for the state, in your view, in order to solve these issues?
Yeah, big question. I mean, I think you're right that there has not been, the most free market approach to this, I think probably would be to levy a carbon tax across the economy, apply it equally to all sectors and let the market find the cheapest way of deploying technologies and reaching our climate goals. I think for political reasons, that's been very challenging. It's a very visible extra cost that people feel when they fill up their car or heat their homes. And so I think politicians have always been reluctant to go down that route, even if it might be the cheapest and most market-friendly way ultimately to tackle it. But I think there are other ways in which we can look at more market-friendly approaches to climate action, which I think are more achievable. So one example I think would be dealing with some of the planning and regulatory issues that are preventing renewable energy from being deployed at scale. There are restrictions on onshore wind in England, even putting rooftop solar on some residential properties can be challenging to get through the planning system. Getting electric vehicle charge points installed, you have from councillors that they have issues navigating the planning system for that. So I think there are ways in which we can expedite planning to get some of these clean technologies deployed. Another example I think we touched on earlier is around trade, and basically trying to use trade as a way to disseminate clean technologies, the most cost-effective and effective clean technologies around the world at lowest cost, reducing the overall cost of reaching net zero. I think that's an agenda that a lot of people can support as well. So I think there are solutions, and I think the market has particularly once these technologies reach these tipping points where they're no longer more expensive than their fossil fuel alternatives, as they are in the case of wind and solar, and getting there with battery electric vehicles, then I think you can see market forces really driving the scale deployment. But I do think that there is a role, in the absence of a carbon tax, the government to prime some of these markets and help them bring down the cost. I think the lesson from solar and wind is that it takes that scale, the economies of scale, and mass manufacturing of those renewable energies for the cost to start coming down. So we've got to achieve that tipping point, and because of the timeframes that we're on in terms of stopping dangerous levels of climate change, we do need to accelerate it a bit more compared to what the market, I think, would do naturally.
There's, of course, a bit of a counter-narrative here from those who don't see climate change as much of a serious issue, but do see even so a massive cost to British consumers of the restructuring of our energy grid to get rid of coal and then pump up solar and wind, and then you're making yourself more dependent on gas and then not domestically having gas at all production at what would be necessary through fracking, for example. How do you respond to that kind of narrative, that the kind of populist backlash against these policies will be kind of inevitable and vast and vicious, and we're all going to be made a lot poorer, and it's not really worth doing any of what you're talking about?
Well, I think in the case of the power sector, there's a report out today by Public First looking at what the kind of lowest cost electricity system would be in 2035, independent of any sort of constraints around carbon and climate change. And they found that a grid dominated by wind power would be the cheapest, in the absence of any concern about climate. So I do think there are some areas, like in the power sector, where actually going harder and faster on the clean technologies will deliver a cheaper overall outcome for the energy sector. So yeah, I think there is definitely there are areas where we do need to put in more investment and more funding in the short term to bring those costs down. But I think looking overall at the net zero transition, I'm confident that will be cheaper than dealing with the impacts of climate change. And I think we've seen the technologies falling in cost all the time. Offshore wind is significantly cheaper than what it was assumed it would be when the net zero target was set, and that has made the whole cost of net zero cheaper. Similarly, the cost of gas is now way more expensive than when we were setting our climate targets, again making the economics of this transition even better. And I think to your point about renewables leading to more reliance on gas, I disagree. I think the more renewables we have, the less we're having to turn on our gas turbines and have them generating 100% of the time. They use more as backup instead of as baseload, and so overall across the year you're burning less gas than you otherwise would. So I think you are reducing your gas dependency by building out renewables.
Of course, if you have, it would help if you have nuclear holding some of the baseline as well as more storage capacity, which I think is where the issue remains. And hopefully the technologies improve on that front. I'm kind of last thought is what you make of some of the kind of more, I guess, radical solutions that we see talked about, things like geoengineering as one example, the idea of effectively spurting up sulfite into the atmosphere to reduce the sun rays and therefore reduce the temperature potentially by a few degrees. If can be mastered, much cheaper solution to climate change than trying to change our entire energy grid. Obviously, there's been a lot of skepticism amongst environmentalists about the kind of God-playing nature when it comes to something as radical as geoengineering. But I'm wondering if there is increasingly more of a place for it, particularly if we are struggling under the current targets to bring down climate change.
Yeah, I mean, geoengineering feels quite risky, and I also think you get into some very complex questions as well around, who is doing that, which countries would you trust to do that process, and what's the kind of international framework for agreeing how that will be done. I think you very quickly get into some quite difficult and complex territory in terms of international relations. Quite aside from all the technological challenges, I do think that there are these cheap and readily available solutions which we're still not maximizing and we're still not deploying as fast as we could do. I think we can make a lot of progress with that. I think there may well be sectors like aviation, like farming, where there are going to be some residual emissions, and I think that's where technologies like direct air capture, which are very energy intensive, currently very expensive, but I think they have potential to help us remove some of the CO2 from those residual sources of emissions over time. And so I think I'd be looking more to those types of solutions, as well as, of course, making sure we restore our natural habitats, which are very good carbon sequesters, our forests, our mangroves, our wetlands, making sure they're in a functioning ecological health so that they can be drawing down as much carbon as well. These solutions, I think, feel more more likely to succeed, and I think have fewer of those challenges around geopolitics.
Well, what might be the slight doomster and gloomster on geoengineering, but definitely optimistic booster about other technologies and ability to address climate change. Thanks so much for joining the IEA podcast, Sam. If you are enjoying the podcast, please do subscribe on your podcast provider as well as on our YouTube channel. And if you're interested in supporting the IEA, please do become an IEA patron where you can get exclusive content in first. So thank you very much.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.